We started last week to talk about the story of Joseph from the book of Genesis, and we're going to go back there. We'll be back in Genesis 37 this morning. Last week we were introduced to Joseph for the first time. Joseph is the son of Jacob. So in the lineage of the patriarchs, it goes Abraham, then Isaac, and Jacob, and then Joseph is one of Jacob's 12 sons. Joseph is the 11th of Jacob's 12 sons. And Joseph, we learned, was favored by Jacob. He was his favorite. Joseph, when we're introduced to him, we see a growing problem that exists between he and his brothers. Joseph, the first thing we learn about him is that he gave his father a bad report about his brothers. And then we see Jacob kind of doting on Joseph in a way that would make his brothers jealous, giving him a coat either of many colors or of long sleeves that would show that he was favored. And we saw Joseph last week receiving dreams from God and then telling them to his brothers in a way that was ungracious or at least insensitive to how they would hear what he was saying. So we know this far into Joseph's story that there is enmity between he and his brothers, that there's not a good relationship, they're not at peace, that they don't like each other. Specifically, Joseph's older brothers don't like him because of the special treatment he is receiving. And for many of you who are oldest children or have a younger sibling, you are familiar with this sensation, right? They always get spoiled. Isn't that right, Jack? Don't the younger ones get spoiled? Yes. Okay. But in Joseph's case, this is happening maybe to an extreme, and there's a lot of enmity there. And so you can imagine him being a little nervous. You can imagine Joseph being a little nervous about the task that his father gives him, as we read here in verse 12 of chapter 37. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem, come, I am going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. I have to wonder if Joseph knew he was in trouble when he was given this task. He certainly had time to think about it when he was on his way, because the journey from Hebron to Shechem is nearly 50 miles. It would have taken him many days to travel this distance. It would have been a lonely journey. Remember, there are no AirPods then, okay? All he had were his thoughts about what it was going to be like, whether or not he would find his brothers, maybe first of all, and then how they would treat him when he was 50 miles away from Dad. This could be a dangerous encounter. Joseph would have certainly known that his brothers can be a little ruthless. We already know this from the account of the Bible. If you look in Genesis 34 and read the story that occurs there, you'll see that Simeon and Levi had recently killed all of the men of Shechem in cold blood in Genesis 34. So maybe one of the reasons why they're able to graze their fields there is because they had killed all of the residents of that town 3 chapters ago. As it turns out, Joseph is going to have even more time to think about how his brothers will receive him because his brothers are no longer in Shechem, as we read in verse 15. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They've moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. Dothan is an additional 12 miles, so another day's journey for Joseph. Now, as we will continue reading, Joseph's story here is going to take a dramatic turn from the worse. So far, what we've read about Joseph is that he is favored by his father, that he is receiving gifts from his father that his brothers aren't receiving, that he is favored by his dad, and that God is revealing to him that he will have power over his brothers, or that his brothers and maybe even his mother and his father will bow down to him, that he will be most important among them. So far, it sounds like a pretty great story for Joseph. But things are going to change here as we start in verse 18. If Joseph was indeed worried when he was on his way to Shechem to meet his brothers, it turns out he had good reason to feel that way. In verse 18 we read, "But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. 'Here comes that dreamer,' they said to each other. 'Come now, let's kill him and throw him to one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams.'" His brothers wanted to kill him. They were indeed ruthless men, and they had a ruthless plan. When they saw their younger brother approaching 60 miles away from dad now, they had a plan to do something wicked, to do something evil. This is not an unusual story in our world. Maybe nobody's ever plotted to kill you before. I hope not. Okay? But we encounter evil and wickedness from other people very often, don't we? I've encountered wickedness and evil treatment by people in my life. I'm not alone in this room, am I? We experience evil and wickedness from other people because of the nature of the human heart and because of what happened in the Garden of Eden. God created us to live in such a way where there was no need of anything, where we were free from guilt, even the awareness of our own shame we were free from. But that ended when mankind, when Adam and Eve chose to reject the kind of life that God had made for us, and all of a sudden the consequences that came from that decision, the consequences not only that we will die, we become mortal, but the fact that our world is full of pain, that our world is full of toil, that we have to eat by the sweat of our brow. These elements of life outside the garden, these elements of life ruled by sin and death, create enmity between people, and thus we treat people in wicked ways. There's a passage I want to point out here. When we think about what his brothers planned to do here to Joseph, when we think about the evil thing that they wanted to do as they saw their brother approaching, think of this verse from James chapter 4. I'll put it on the screen. It says, "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from the desires that battle within you? You desire, but you do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight." His brothers were covetous of the favor that Joseph had with his father. They were jealous of what they did not have from their dad, maybe the position that Joseph had that they didn't, where Joseph was free from the labor of tending the flocks as they were assigned. And so they decided to try to kill him. They decided to do something wicked so that they could seek their own comfort, so that they could seek their own favor through their father, so that they could seek their own success. It is a story that plays out over and over again every day across the world. That because life is hard, because we live a life where we suffer much, we are often desperate enough to seek our own pleasure, to seek our own comfort, that we choose to do evil in pursuit of it. It's not just true for us, it's true for all the people around us. And so oftentimes we will be caught unsuspected by people who are willing to do something wicked against us so that they could benefit from it. Now, Joseph is not totally guiltless here. Joseph, as we read last week, his boasting and the way he treated the blessings that God gave him led in some way to this moment. If he hadn't been so careless about the way that he presented the dreams that he was given about his future to his brothers and to his family, then he may not have arrived at this moment where his brothers see him approaching and want to kill him. But listen, he certainly did not deserve this. Does somebody deserve to be killed just for being boastful about a dream? His minor infraction of boastfulness and ungraciousness causes suffering for him that is way, way out of proportion for what he did wrong. Have you ever suffered that way before? when you are having a miserable time and suffering terrible mistreatment, think of things when you were suffering from other people the most, when things are really gone wrong for you. Have you ever been able to look back and see one little seemingly minor mistake or sin that you did that started all that mess? It's happened to me all too often. Our broken world can take our minor mistakes, the times when we mess up maybe unintentionally, or the time that we do something that seems relatively minor, and turn them into so much pain for us. When we combine our own sins with our broken and sinful world filled with other sinful people, it can be like dropping a Mentos in a Coke bottle. After we've messed up a little, we often suffer pain that is unfair and disproportional to our error. In this case, the reason why Joseph's minor sin, Joseph's error of being ungracious or uncaring about how his brothers felt, gets blown up into a situation so dire that he's going to be murdered because of the sinfulness of Joseph's brothers. It's the way that our world works, where we have sinful people bouncing their sins off of each other and developing offense and anger. Joseph's brothers take Joseph's minor sin and blow it up into a life-threatening and ultimately a life-altering moment for Joseph. The truth is that as long as you live in this world, you will suffer the evil and wickedness of others. It will happen. Maybe sometimes you will see it coming, like I think Joseph might have seen it coming here. Other times you won't. Our world is fallen and sinful, and the human heart is no exception. And as long as we are here, we will suffer that evil. You cannot avoid it, and God will not remove you from the consequences of the evil actions of yourself and of other people until all wickedness and sin are forever condemned and cast out from his eternal kingdom. We will suffer interpersonal evil, and we will witness others suffer it as well. In fact, at times, we will be the ones treating someone else wickedly. As the story of Joseph goes on, we will see the importance of how we respond to that wicked treatment, of how we persevere through being treated in an evil way by somebody. But today, we don't get to hear from Joseph at all. Joseph's speaking role is over in today's passage. And instead, as we read on, I want you to see two other characters in this story and how they work through the situation they find themselves in. First up is Reuben. Reuben is the oldest son of Jacob. The most important thing to remember about Reuben always is to not forget the Thousand Island dressing. That's going to kick in here in a couple seconds. Starting in verse 21. When Reuben heard this, when he heard his brother's plan, he tried to rescue Joseph from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, and there was no water in it. Look at here. Reuben is in a group of people who have decided to kill Joseph, and he knows this is wrong. He witnesses the evil that's about to happen, and even though he is among the party offended by Joseph, even though he is one of the people who Joseph said uncaringly about his dream that he would be bowing down to him, Reuben says, hold on. Don't kill Joseph. Don't shed his blood. What we learn is Reuben tells them instead of killing him and throwing him into the cistern, let's just throw him into the cistern for now. Okay? And then Reuben exits stage left. I'm not sure what he's doing over there, maybe coming up with some plan to rescue his brother, but he steps away. But it's worth noting here that Reuben tries to get in the way. He tries to do something about the wickedness and the evil that he knows he's about to witness. Reuben isn't alone in this story. Reuben, like I said, is absent from the next part of the story, and Judah, the fourth son of Leah, steps in at this point, as we read on in verse 25. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him after all. He is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Judah, too, sees the wrong thing that's about to be done, and he knows that this is wrong. Now, you may wonder about Judah's intentions here. It's fair to wonder about Judah's intentions. Maybe instead of just wanting to save his brother, he wanted to make 20 shekels of silver over his brother, and that would be a more efficient way of disposing him than murder. Okay? But we do also hear him say in verse 27, "After all, he is our brother and our own flesh and blood. This is not something that we should be doing." Even though they could get away with it, right? Judah sees that this is something that's wicked, that is something they shouldn't do. So he talks his brothers out of doing it. Judah's plan is actually, though maybe less well-intentioned than Reuben's, much more effective. I want you to see these two characters in Joseph's story, in what happens here in this moment in Dothan, and I want you to think about doing something about the evil that you see in your world and in your life. The sad and unfortunate truth is all of us will experience interpersonal evil. In fact, we will probably be a part of the way that people are treated wickedly. It is the truth about our world, our world which has fallen to sin, that we will experience that. I want you to see the story of Reuben and Judah and the way they treated Joseph, and I want you to think about how you can stand in the way of evil. How can you stand in the way of injustice? Okay. Oftentimes we may think about this on the level of governments and government decisions and party affiliation, right? But for Judah and Reuben, their intervention against evil occurred on the level of their siblings. Okay? And oftentimes, I think that is the best place for you to start. Do you know anyone in your family that is suffering evil, that is being mistreated, that you can stand up for, that you can intervene on behalf of, that you can love and serve and advocate for? Are there people in your workplace who suffer injustice? Are there people in your community who are mistreated by others? Will you do something about the evil you see? Joesph has a younger brother who is probably not here. So he's got 10 brothers out in the field. 2 stood up for him. 2 stood up for him and they saved his life. You may be one of the only people willing to stand up for the person in your life who is suffering, the person in your life who is being mistreated. Will you do it? Are you brave enough to take a stand against the mob that wants to mistreat them? Against the whole group of people who has decided that it is better and cooler and easier to mistreat the person that you're thinking of? When God is directing his people about what they should do, about how they should be in the first chapter of Isaiah, he tells them this: learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. God has laid upon us the burden and the blessing of standing up against the evil and darkness of our world. Even though our world is subject to sin and our hearts are corrupted by it, because we have received the light of Jesus Christ, because we are redeemed and belong to his eternal kingdom now, instead of the kingdom of this world, we have a responsibility to live the truth of God's new life for us. That means we cannot watch evil and wickedness win unopposed. That means we have a burden like Reuben and Judah to do something about the wickedness and evil that goes on. And I don't even think Reuben and Judah are perfect examples of what that would look like. They're probably minimally good examples of what that looks like. You can imagine a better way for Reuben and Judah to intervene on behalf of their brother. If one of them were to say, you know what, if you are going to harm him, you're going to have to come through me. Or if you're going to sell him into slavery, then you're selling me along with him. And I'm headed to Egypt with Joseph. Okay? Those would be better options. But here, at least we see Reuben and Judah do something. How willing are you to stand in the way of evil or injustice for people who you see being mistreated? It's not a question to answer here in this pew. It's a question to answer outside this room when you do something about it. Let's finish reading the passage here in Genesis 37, starting in verse 29. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" And then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned his son for many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. The story ends with a heartbroken father. In fact, the story of Joseph that we get in Genesis is really, it's a story that's bookended by his father's love at beginning and end. I want you to see Jacob's grief here over the death of his son. Clearly he loved Joseph. And I also want you to see that Reuben and Judah are the reason that Jacob's son is still alive. Reuben and Judah are the reason that Jacob will one day have the joy of seeing his son again. Because when they saw the wickedness and evil going on around them, the wickedness and evil that other people were planning and trying to do to someone they knew, to someone they had a responsibility to love, they stood in the way. They did something about it. Will you stand up to evil like they did? Are you willing to stand in the way of someone who wants to treat somebody in your life wickedly? Are you willing to have those tough conversations, to speak those honest words, to protect the people that God loves, even when it's popular or trendy to mistreat them? Go from this place today and get in the way of evil. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for standing in the way of evil for us. Thank you for sending your Son to confront the powers that held us in bondage. Heavenly Father, you have put people in our lives who we see suffer wickedness. You have put people in our lives who we have seen get left by the wayside, who we have seen being treated wickedly. God, give us the strength, the resolve, the backbone to stand in the way of evil, to protect those who are oppressed and mistreated. Dear Heavenly Father, help us not just to receive gracious love from you, but to give it. To give it to those in our life who need it for their own protection from wickedness and evil of our sinful world around us. We pray these things in your name. Amen.